coverage. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. Till this morning, there was a scenario of gloom and doom as far as the economy is concerned. There was a narrative of the slowdown that we find ourselves in the middle of, a drop in consumption and a surcharge on FPIs or foreign portfolio investors has spooked the markets, and a cascading effect was seen across the economy. But this evening, at about 5:15 this evening, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman unveiled a slew of measures which would lift the economy, boost the economy, and clearly targeted at various sections of the economy that were hurting. She has in fact promised a second and third installment as well in the weeks to come. We're going to be taking a look at how effective these measures will be, and have they really succeeded in changing sentiment, because that perhaps is the most important question. Joining me now on the show for more on this is Mr. Arvind Panagariya, of course, top economist and former vice chairman of the Niti Aayog. Mr. Panagariya, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening on ET Now. A few days ago, you wrote a very widely read and appreciated piece on how the government should deal with the current economic slowdown, and the gist of your message was that giving sops to every sector which was hurting is not necessarily the answer. Structural changes need to be made. What is your response to the kind of announcements we've seen today? There is something for everyone, from the auto sector to the rollback of the FPI surcharge for MSMEs, something to keep everyone happy at this point. How do you read the efforts made by the finance minister this evening?
I think the finance minister gets 10 out of 10. What I had called for, Tamanna, is a reform package, and this is a reform package. So we should really call it that. And not some sort of stimulus package. These are all measures that some of us had called for, particularly, some of the measures in the budget, like the CSR, the criminal penalties if you don't do your CSR, and the surcharge on the income tax on the institutional investors and so forth. So these have been removed. I think these were bad signals. They did actually unnecessarily kind of send a negative signal on the government, which is otherwise reformist government. And so I'm very pleased, very good. I wish actually that the finance minister had one more item on that list. So number 7, which would be the privatization of many of these public sector enterprises. I would really like to see that on the agenda as well, because at the end of the day, we want to be a private enterprise economy, not a public enterprise economy.
No, absolutely. But, we can hope for more, because the finance minister has promised another set of announcements next week, and a third installment later coming in from there. Just the thrust of what she has announced today, and a significant part of it seems to be the government stepping in to spend more. Or to clear blockages in payments. Few important ones like making sure current pending GST refunds are cleared within 30 days for MSMEs, 60 days for other refunds from here on. The government departments deciding to go out and replace old vehicles, so basically buying cars and reducing some of that inventory that car makers are looking at. An upfront 70,000 crore rupees going to public sector banks for recapitalization. Do you think such measures could have perhaps come in on the 5th of July budget, or was there a wait and watch attitude to see what goes on next, and hence we've seen these measures come now, nearly 2 months later?
So, this is all speculation, so it's hard for me to tell. Also there has been a leadership change. Remember, at the finance ministry, there has been a change of the DEA secretary and so forth. So, we don't know who played what role in the measures that were put in place and what was on the budget, in the budget speech itself. It seems to me, though, that purely from the optics of it, that the finance minister, who had been who had just arrived actually on the scene, has not taken full charge. She clearly held lots of meetings with lots of groups of people, sought her own kind of personal advice from various constituents, and then put together the package, which at the end of the day looks extremely good, meaning that, this is the kind of response. I mean, my take always is, Tamanna, that look, when the opportunity arrives, even when we are in a downturn, that is an opportunity to actually take reformist measures. That's the time to mobilize all the constituencies and say, look, we require action. Do something which is not of a temporary nature, meaning that, that you give a subsidy or something for the short term and go home. Instead, what has been done is what needs to be done in the longer run also. For example, speeding up of the refunds to the MSMEs and so forth. I think that has to be there for good. I mean, it's not a temporary measure. Also, I think by retracting some of the things that had been in the budget, the finance minister has also given the signal that, look, I'm going to respond. If I make a mistake, I will backtrack. And that is a very, very good signal to give to the markets.
And a very important one, Mr. Panagariya. I just want to focus on that part for a little bit, because two major decisions. One is the kind of criminal charges for non-compliance of CSR measures. So there was a clarification on that these will only be civil liabilities. The withdrawal of the surcharge on FPIs, etc. Do you think that this was, in a sense, an admission that things had gone wrong and should be looked at in that regard, that this finance ministry is willing to listen and correct?
Exactly. So, I mean, I personally wouldn't say that, that, there's an admission of mistake or something. I think I like to put a very positive view of it, which is that, it's a large system. The finance ministry itself is extremely big. And so occasional mistakes happen. At the end of the day, bureaucrats are bureaucrats. They are not ultimately specialists. And so when some mistakes happen and the finance minister takes a lead and says that I'm going to correct it, I think she ought to be congratulated wholeheartedly without any sort of trace of this kind of, feeling that, you're admitting that you made a mistake. I think that's a wrong way to react.
Okay. Now let's come to the broader picture, Mr. Panagariya, because the measures announced today are undoubtedly welcome and will go to some extent to dispel the kind of atmosphere we're seeing right now in the economy, in corporate India, etc. But what more is required in your view here on? And I want to touch upon this in a bit of detail. So let me start with one specific aspect, which is increasing the demand and consumption. Because we're hearing of all of these stories of consumption dropping, and you need people to go out and buy. The government is taking the lead by putting down money and saying that they will buy more. But what really will go a long way in putting more money in people's hands so that they spend and kickstart that cycle of the economy?
Right. So I personally think that, that is the area where the financial markets have to start kicking in. The government, by announcing the 70,000 crore upfront kind of recapitalization, has done its part. I do not think that the government is at all in any position now to spend actual money of its own on top of what had been promised in the budget. I really think that if you look at what is going on in terms of extra budgetary borrowing by the government to finance expenditures, the fisc, if you take the entire public sector together, not just the budget fisc, but also the off-budget borrowing that is happening, or extra budgetary borrowing that is called, I think, we cannot ask the government to do more. Let the financial market, I think, again, this calls for reforms of financial markets so that transmission happens. And that also, I saw one of the reports just now that the banks are saying that they will pass on the 35 basis point reduction that the RBI did. And that is where the action has to really shift now, not through the government expenditure increases.
So you're absolutely right, sir. So banks will now be linking their lending rates to repo rates. So there should be a greater transmission. Another very big focus and emphasis by the finance minister was on reducing what is being called tax terrorism and making interactions faceless. Now, she spoke about this in the budget as well, but that in itself didn't do much. Do you think more work is required on this, and is it really such a big concern in the larger picture?
Well, once again, what happens is that, wherever the injury happens, you hear people scream. So it seems that, certainly you hear quite a lot that this sort of, excessive demands being made on the taxpayers by the tax inspectors and tax collectors. That I hear from a lot of different sets of people. So perhaps some action certainly is required. We also, the economic surveys had put together some of the numbers on the number of tax cases that the finance ministry brings out, and the rates at which they lose, very high rate of losses of these cases when they go to high courts. Even at the income tax appellate levels, the officers actually, they lose their cases in very vast proportions. So it does seem that that the cases are brought in. I mean, I understand that the bureaucratic safety leads, the quest for safety leads bureaucrats to bring up the cases rather than sort of just accept something outside of the appellate rulings. But I think some restraint is important, because it also leads to a lot of delays in all sorts of things. So yes, I think we need to continue to do more on that front, and particularly when this kind of pressure goes on, all kinds of tax notices go to the people who are actually paying their taxes in an honest sort of way. I mean, I know I've got a friend, who says that, look, on the one hand, I get this gold certificate for being a fantastic taxpayer. And this is a professional, who, and then on the other hand, he starts getting the tax notices. So that sort of thing should not be happening. And the more we can computerize this process, so that most of the identification for audits is done through the computer kind of analysis, thereby reducing the human involvement, the less the chances that frivolous cases will be initiated.
I want to hark back to something you said a little while earlier, Mr. Panagariya, when you pointed out that beyond a point, the government doesn't have the room to spend. And we've set ourselves a fiscal deficit target of 3.3%. Now, there is this point of view that at this current juncture of the slowdown that we're going through, it is okay and perhaps a good idea to loosen that target just a little bit. Increase some spends at this point to kickstart the whole progress. The whole process. Where do you stand on that?
You see, Tamanna, what is happening is, what we are not realizing here is that there is a large number of public sector agencies today which are not appearing on the budget. They borrow. Food Corporation of India alone borrows more than 1% of the GDP. There is a huge borrowing. But apparently, your own newspaper, the Economic Times, ran a report about a week or 10 days ago, where it referred to a PowerPoint presentation by the CAG to the Finance Commission. And that presentation apparently says that there is an additional more than 2 percentage point deficit or borrowing that is happening in the market by these extra budgetary agencies. Food Corporation of India, the Higher Education Authority or Financing Authority, you got NABARD. There's a very large number of these agencies. And let me explain a little bit what is going on there. That what happens is that the Prime Minister is very ambitious. He wants to bring change very rapidly. And so what has happened is that a lot of the ministries which have these extra budgetary borrowing agencies, they have become competitors. And they also, because ultimately ministry is measured by how much it spends. So they have also gone on a borrowing spree. And since they are off budget, it becomes a little easier. So off budget borrowing is expanding And this Economic Times report said that, according to the CAG presentation, the 2017-18 fiscal deficit, when you pull together all the public sector, was 5.85%. So this is central government alone, not the state governments is separate. So compared to that, on the budget, fiscal deficit for 17-18 actually is reported as 3.46%. So this is 2.25 percentage points added to 3.5 percentage points. I think that's already huge. And therefore, to ask the government to do more, breach even its budgetary fiscal deficit commitment, I think that's a crime.
You mentioned one item, sir, on your wish list, number 7, you said, which would be the process of disinvestment. A little more detail on that, and also what you would like to see next in terms of a framework. We know that there are going to be 2 more sets of announcements, but this is clearly an ongoing process. Where do you see the reform path going from here, and what needs to be the priority?
So on privatization, this again would be a very important signal to the markets, and incidentally, it would also help in the fiscal deficit, right? I mean, it brings revenues. And what I feel is that, there is a number of these public sector enterprises where the government stake is not very large, meaning above 50%. So there are several of these public sector enterprises which are listed on the stock market, and government stake is in some cases 54%, 58%, 60%. In these cases, it's pretty straightforward to bring the stake down below 50%. Now, you could stop once you get it below 50%. A board can come to actually manage the enterprise, and effective privatization would happen. And then the government can still hold 49% of the share in the value of the enterprise. Because that is worthwhile, because in future the once the unit goes into private hands, very likely the stock value will rise. So I think that's something that can be done in a relatively short period of time, painlessly, bring some revenue for the government. And it also sends a fantastic signal to the markets that the government believes in the private economy. Rather than use up the public money in repeatedly restructuring these public sector enterprises, which then almost never recover in the way private sector enterprises would. I think it's better to let these things are to be run by the private sector. Let them do it. So that's one. But we can discuss other areas of reform if you wish.
I just have actually one last question to ask you, Mr. Panagariya, and it's an important one, because you, in your piece, gave the sense that you don't believe any specific sectors should get quote-unquote bailouts. It's a statement that was echoed by the Chief Economic Advisor when he spoke to us later as well. You do have some kind of sops for the auto sector in this set of announcements, but then there are other sectors that are hurting, the real estate sector, for example. Do you think just changing the set of policies around it will be enough, or will more need to be done at this point, especially to lift key sectors which are huge employment generators?
Sorry, Taman, I just don't believe that we should be doing SOPs, because it simply tells the private sector that, as long as you're making profit, you're fine. The moment you begin to make losses, I would come to your rescue. I think that's a surefire recipe for encouraging inefficiency and coming in the way of restructuring of the economy. A dynamic economy has creative destruction. And that creative destruction has to happen. And auto industry is a perfect example there. So many inefficiencies, so many small little plants, a single company kind of doing all kinds of different things, 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, 4-wheelers, commercial vehicles, this, that, and the other. That only means that they have small plants. And in a global economy like ours, you can't do that. No wonder the car industry has a share of just 0.9% in the export market, which is $740 billion strong, going by 2017 figures. I personally don't think this is a good idea. Anytime, let me just make this point, allow me just half minute. When companies can come in and say, oh, I will have to lay off so many workers if you don't do something for me. Well, it seems to me that, then it becomes quite rational for me as the industry or as an enterprise to start employing a few extra workers anyway, whom I can then lay off when going gets tough. It becomes my insurance then. That just because if I go by some of the numbers that have been given out in auto industry, from top to bottom, including the CEO down to the watchman, Mr. Rajiv Bajaj said yesterday in his own company, the wage bill is 4% of his total costs. So if it is 4%, it becomes quite rational for me then to employ a few workers extra. And whenever the going gets tough, I say that, well, look, do something for me. Otherwise, I will have to lay off these workers. So this creates these perverse incentives. And in any case, the government ought to allow industry to adjust. Whenever downturns happen, this is how efficiency, this is how the American economy renews itself. That the market comes in and says, okay, during downturn, anybody who was not competitive and during a boom and
if you allow me, sir, I just want to get. I know we're out of time, but I just have to tell you one opposing point of view which has come forward to that, just to take that debate forward. Is when you compare this to market economies in more developed countries and say that, hey, play by the rules, the counter argument is then there are no policy restrictions as well in these economies. We do admittedly have more policy restrictions for various reasons. So is it a fair playing ground?
No, so I totally agree with you. Let us therefore argue for removing those policy restrictions. I'm totally with you on that. And this is why I said that the package that the finance minister has today announced is a reform package. I don't see this as a stimulus package.
Absolutely.
And that is how we ought to do. I completely agree with you.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. That was Arvind Panagariya speaking to us exclusively on the big reform package unveiled by the finance minister this evening. We'll take a very short break, but do stay with us. All the biggest highlights and analysis on the other side on ET Now.